Hey, everybody. Hey, thanks for joining for the content today. We're going to talk a lot about training metrics, what they all mean. Some of them, I hope that you've heard of all of them before, but we'll dig into some of them a little deeper than others just because they need more clarity. To get us started, I want to break some of the data into two different things, right? We have outcomes and input. Outcomes are things that we're looking at like pace and speed, watts, whether that's normalized power or average watts or watts per kilogram. Those are outcome data pieces. In input or response data are things like what's your heart rate doing, what's it feel like, so RPE and that sort of thing. As we're going through, and we'll hit all these in some detail here, like I said, but I'm gonna go through swim, bike, and run, and on the swim, what's the important metric that we look at, or metrics that we look at, and what do they mean, and so forth. If you've seen some of our other Zoom meetings, and when we talk about swim, bike, and run specifically, you've heard me talk about many of these details or these metrics relative to performance and training and efficiency and that sort of thing. I want to go into not how to swim more efficient, but what do the metrics mean? What are we looking for? And what are some things that you can use to compare your improvement? Some of these things we can look at in terms of improved performance. We can look at things in terms of, are we getting overtrained? Are we too fatigued? Do we need a break? Do we need recovery? And sometimes when we're in plateau places where we're working really hard, but things aren't changing, we can look at a metric and try to modify it as we're going through. So as we get started, let's start with a swim. Things that we look at specifically on the swim, we're looking at obviously pace. How fast are you swimming? And we measure that in terms of either minutes per 100 yards or minutes per 100 meters, depending what size pool you're using. If you're looking at a fast Olympic type swimmer, they're well under a minute per 100. If you're looking at some of our average age groupers, it's going to be around 2 minutes per 100. Unless, of course, you're in a body of water that has a flow to it, such as a river, your pace may be different. But obviously in a pool, that's either 25 yards or meters, the average pace that you would look at, you can use that metric to see improvements. Now, there are different paces that you would expect to have if you're doing a 25 versus if you're doing a 500, right? So your average pace to do a 25, if you've put in a fairly hard effort, is going to be faster than if you have an average pace for a 500. That's the same as you on your runs. You can sprint for 100 yards a lot faster, your average pace on a sprint, versus if you're going to do a 5-mile run. So that's where we're looking at pace, and you can use that obviously to compare improvements. RPE, rate of perceived exertion. We'd use that metric, and we use this metric a lot in the swim. How does it feel? Have an easy effort, have a more intense effort, have an exhaustive effort. RPE is used across the spectrum here of how does it feel. A 1 is very light, a 10 is very hard. And so you could use that subjective metric to see how you're doing. How could you use that? So let's say you're looking at pace, and your pace hasn't changed. You're still at a 2 minutes per 100 pace, but the effort feels easier. That would be a great way to look at your improvement. Having less effort to do the same pace or the same speed or the same pace metric. Okay. So heart rate could be looked at in swim, and some of your devices would calculate or measure your heart rate. If you've got a chest strap, that's really hard to do. It doesn't read, it's obviously has to connect to your watch or your device that you're using, and it usually will not go through the water. So if you're wearing a chest strap, or if you've got a device that you're using a chest strap, you're not going to get heart rate most likely. They do have some that can do that, but anyway, if you're wearing a watch that has the LED and it's getting your heart rate off of through the LEDs, you're more likely to have that heart rate. I'm not a huge fan of using heart rate in swim. It's just, you're not going to look at your heart rate while you're swimming anyway. So, you can't truly use that to see if you're pushing hard enough. It would be a metric you could look at afterwards, similar to RPE, and say, hey, I swam at this pace and my heart rate was here 2 months ago. Now I'm swimming at the same pace or a little faster and my heart rate has improved. So you could use that to perhaps compare metrics. But in terms of me setting you up and saying, hey, use heart rate as a metric while you're swimming, that's really hard to do. Okay, now let's talk about specific swim metrics in terms of performance improvement. So you could look at your cadence. Yeah, so if your cadence is in the 30s and you're just getting started and you're at a certain pace, and then a month from now, six weeks from now, your cadence is faster, perhaps, and you're going a little faster, you could say that the cadence metric helped you get faster. If you're looking at strokes per length, how many strokes does it take you to get from point A to point B? As you improve your performance, a metric to look at would be, can you decrease your strokes per length? With that, if your strokes per length are decreasing, the distance that you're covering per stroke should be increasing. Okay, does that make sense? So it would be similar to running, where if your stride length increases, it should take you less strides to cover a certain distance. If your distance per stroke increases, it should take you less strokes or strokes per length to get the same distance. Okay, and in the swim video or in the swim conversation, we talked about the relationship of working on your form, working your technique to be able to have less strokes per length as an efficiency metric. And then as you got that under control, you would use your cadence, trying to increase your cadence without losing your form in your swim technique to measure your fitness. So if you're having a higher cadence, you're going to have a better fitness. If you have a decreased strokes per length, you're going to have better form, better efficiency in your swim stroke. So all those metrics can be applied to look at different aspects of your swim. Okay. Let's go on to the run. I'm going to skip the bike because the bike has a bunch of stuff that, a bunch of details, and then that's usually where we get lost. I'm going to, instead of swim, bike, run, we're going to go swim, run, bike today. So on the run, obviously you've got heart rate. Most of us know about the heart rate and the zones and so forth, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time there. But you've got threshold rate, heart rate, you've got max heart rate, you've got aerobic heart rate, and those are all different zones that we would use to predict pacing and so forth. We've got your rate of perceived exertion, how hard is that effort going? And then we've got your pace. And we've talked before about using those three metrics to look at the fitness elephant relative to your run. If I'm running at a certain RPE, I should have a certain heart rate, and I'll usually be going at a certain pace. And you can use that, assuming the terrain's all equal, you're not running into a big headwind, you're all things being equal, you can use those three metrics to kind of see where you're at on that particular day. How well did you sleep? How well did you rest? How well are you doing that day? And if you have a up day or a down day, one of those three metrics are usually influencing that spot. Okay, so let's dig a little deeper in some other metrics relative to this. So just like in the swim, we've got a cadence metric. We have a stride length metric. Okay, so the longer your stride is, and I'm not talking about overstriding, I'm talking about how much ground do you cover when you're running at a certain effort. That will be influenced not by necessarily overstriding and reaching out in front of you and getting that foot in front of you and having poor form, but how hard are you pushing off on the backside? The motor firing sequence will play a role in this. Your form plays a role in this. But the longer your stride, and the higher your cadence, the faster you're going to go. Okay, and it's speed. If we look at a true physics principle, it's speed is equal to stride length times cadence. We're going to calculate your speed. I'm not talking about pace. I'm talking about speed. If we're going to calculate your speed, it's stride length times cadence. So stride length is usually measured in meters. So if it's 1.1 or 1.08 or 1.2 or whatever you've got, and you're taking 180 steps per minute, then we would know what your speed would be. We know what your cadence times stride length is. We could calculate your speed. It's a simple math formula. Vertical oscillation, if you go into your Garmin, and look in your details down there, you may see a thing called vertical oscillation. That is how high are you getting off the ground on each stride. It's usually measured in centimeters. The lower that is, the better. You don't want to be doing a lot of bounding up and down as you're running. You want to have a lower vertical oscillation. Some generalized numbers, if you're over 13, 12 centimeters on your vertical oscillation, you're not very efficient in terms of your vertical oscillation. You're bounding off the ground higher than you would need to, which means you're putting more force on your body, and you would have a tendency to have more stress from that higher vertical oscillation. So we would want to then work on your vertical ratio. Vertical ratio is your vertical oscillation and your divided by your stride length. So the longer your stride is and the lower your vertical oscillation, the better your vertical ratio is, which means the more efficient you are. Okay, so you want that ratio to be smaller, which means you're more efficient. Now let's hit that again. Vertical oscillation is how high off the ground, measured in centimeters, you go each stride, and there would be an average. If you pull up your Garmin, you can look down, scroll down some of the metrics, and you'll see vertical oscillation. You want that number to be under 12. If you head it down to 6, or even 6 is probably a good number. I tell you, if you get it under 10, I'm happy for you. If you've got that vertical oscillation there and you have a longer stride, then you're going to have a greater vertical ratio, which is the vertical oscillation divided by your stride length. Garmin would calculate that for you. Those are the averages for each of those. The smaller the ratio, the more efficient your running pattern is. So you can go into your Garmin and look at a particular run and say, hey, this felt a certain way. And if it felt good, maybe look at your vertical oscillation, vertical ratio, and see if there's a tendency on your good runs or your good efforts that you have a lower vertical oscillation or a smaller vertical ratio. Conversely, when you're having you look at a run, you're like, man, that wasn't my best run. Or is your vertical oscillation higher, which means you got to work harder? Is your vertical ratio larger, which means you're less efficient? So that'd be something that you could do on your own. Look at a particular run and you've got an opinion about it, and you dig down into some of the metrics. What do your run metrics tell you about that particular run? How efficient were you in that effort? Okay. So those are your run metrics, the ones that I look at the most, the ones that I consider important relative to looking at efficiency and areas that you can improve. Again, the heart rate, the RPE, the pace are the ones that we can look at the fitness elephant and make comparisons. And the days that you have all three of those lined up and they feel glorious, those are wonderful days. You can dig deeper by looking into your stride length, looking at your vertical oscillation, and then you'll end up with a vertical ratio. Again, you don't have to do all the math for those. Those would be calculated within your device. Okay, let's move on to bike. You're going to see some consistencies. Heart rate is something that we would use on the bike. RPE is something we could use on the bike. Instead of speed, pace, we would measure the output in terms of watts. And watts is simply a unit of measure similar to pounds. If you're lifting a weight or a dumbbell, that dumbbell is measured in pounds. The work output or the force on the bike is measured in watts. So in your head, they're not the same. But I want you to think that when you're doing strength work, you're lifting pounds. When you're doing bike work, you're lifting watts or moving watts. Okay. So The easy metrics on bike is how hard is your heart working? How many watts are you putting out? And then what kind of speed do you have? And how does it feel? And you could use all those in terms of looking at that bike and saying, hey, that was a good bike, that was a bad bike, or I'm feeling positive, negative, and put those into perspective. We're going to talk watts. Watts is going to give us a lot of information from here. We're going to dig deeper into it. Functional threshold power is the amount of watts, the volume of watts, the average of watts that you could sustain in a max effort for 1 hour. Okay. Functional threshold power is the amount of watts that you could sustain for an hour. Now, if you could ride for an hour as hard as you can, you ride for an hour as hard as you can, it's really hard to stay focused long enough to truly do that kind of test. So there's other tests that we could use to predict or to get close to your functional threshold power. There's a 20-minute test, and many of you have had the experience to enjoy that sort of test. It's an exhaustive test where for 20 minutes you go everything you can, you divide those 20 minutes into 4 5-minute blocks, and you build up and you are completely exhausted at the end. Your average heart rate would become your threshold heart rate for the bike. Your average watts would be multiplied by 0.95 to give you your FTP, the amount that you could ride for an hour. And then those values would then be used to set your training zones. Okay. Similarly, let's kind of backtrack just a little bit. If you're going to set your heart rate training zones on the run, we would have you perhaps do a 5K run. We would see what your average pace was. We would see what your average heart rates were, and we would have your threshold. And we could use that threshold to then set your training zones, your recovery pace, your aerobic pace, your steady state or tempo effort, your threshold effort, and then we could use that and also get your VO2 or your HIIT intensities, HIIT speeds, things that you would do for much shorter durations. Okay, so your functional threshold power is basically that same thing relative to the bike. And we would use that FTP to now set your training zones. I would consider it for the bike one of the more valuable numbers to have. We can use heart rate, we could use pace, but it's really hard to be consistent with those going up and down, and they're not great metrics in terms of knowing what the true physiologic effect is for you on the bike. An example, my heart rate when I go on the bike, I can push some significant watts, and my heart rate won't respond the same as some individuals pushing the same watts. Their heart rate responds a lot higher. Their cost to do that volume of watts is higher for them with their heart rate. And so there's some individuals do a great job or are easy to do heart rate based bike training. There's a few of us that just doesn't work for. So that's where I really like the watts more, because they are consistent. They are very objective. We don't have to do a test to get the FTP. We can get there several different ways. I just like to torture some of you. We could inspect ride files. We could have you do certain rides and intensities and see what your averages are over several rides, and then we can predict your FTP or what you could ride at and get there. We could use different durations, different intensities, and see what you did. And if we're expecting that you're going to do an aerobic ride and you ride a certain watts, we could extrapolate that into something else. But we don't have one data point, so we'd use multiple rides to get there. We could actually put you on a bike and start drawing blood and know exactly what your lactate threshold is by reading your lactate, and use that number to get your FTP. We could put you on in a race. We could have you have a 1 hour race and you ride as hard as you can in that race and use either your normalized or your average power as what you're really able to put out in that. That would be a live test. And then there's all kinds of power tests. We just described one of them, the 20-minute all out. There's ramp tests, there's 30-minute tests. There's a bunch of different pieces. I like doing the 20-minute tests. and then also a 5-minute test, and also a 1-minute test, and then also some max efforts. So I can see a power duration curve metric and do some comparisons within that and see how your profile looks, right? Real quick on the profile, this isn't a metric that you'll look at, but it's interesting that you can look at some of your comparisons. If your max watt effort is, I'm gonna make up numbers. If your max watt effort is 1,000 watts, so you can hit that for 5 seconds. But your FTP, your 20-minute effort is 150. You need some aerobic fitness. You need to be able to carry higher weight, higher watts for a longer period of time. Because we know you got the strength to get to 1,000 watts, you just can't carry those for very long. Okay. Now, if your max watts is 400 and your FTP is at 250, I need to get you more power. You need more strength because you're able to carry a higher percentage of your max watts for that 20 minutes for that FTP. Your low-hanging fruit is to get you more leg strength, get you to get more power, get you to get more force on that bike. And so those are two extreme examples of, like, when we do the test the way I was describing it, the 1 minute, the 5 minute, the 20, and then the power burst there, kind of tells us where we're at as a cyclist, of where we need to attack that low-hanging fruit. Okay. Now that's, as we get into FTP and watts and so forth, that is where most of us have a decent understanding. Now we start diving a little deeper into this. Average watts and normalized power. So average power, average watts, and normalized watts can be the same number, and they can be significantly different. Okay. If you have constant pedal stroke, if you have a constant pedal stroke, you're on a flat surface or you're on a trainer, and for 1 hour you're riding with the same effort all the way through, your normalized power and your average watts will be the same because there are no zeros. Your average watts don't drop down because you hit zeros. You got a constant effort going through there. If you're riding on that same flat surface or on your trainer and you pause your pedal stroke, you release some of the tension, the watts off of that. On the average watts, you're going to have some zeros mixed in, where your average watts is going to be lower than normalized. Normalized uses your heart rate to also look at your physiological cost of that effort. So if you're out and you're climbing some hills and you've got a spike and you're going to push really hard, but on the downhill you're coasting, your average watts will be low. Your normalized power is going to go up because your heart rate went up, and it's going to stay up for a period of time. And so it gives you a higher watt value, a correlated effort to those watts, a normalized value. Okay. So that's the difference between those two. And usually your devices will give you that. They'll use your heart rate and the watts, and they'll give you use a formula, and they'll give you the normalized power, and then you'll see your average watts, which is simply, as it says, an average. If you got some zeros, it's going to bring that number down. As we're looking at comparing normalized and average watts, we're getting deep. Get ready. There's a thing called variability index, VI. You'll see it listed as VI in your metrics. What's the variety, or how smooth was that ride? So if you've got a lot of pauses, you're going to have a higher VI. You're going to have a bigger variability index. If you have a VI of 1.00, that was a very smooth, even effort. If you have a variability effort of 1.2, you've got a lot of variety going on inside there. If you've got a 1.5, you got a lot of variety. You paused quite a bit, or you're going up and down the big hills, and you were not very smooth in your pedaling consistently across that ride. So the more variety and whether you're pedaling and how you're pedaling, you have a higher VI. Your goal would be to have a VI that's 1.05 or less, smooth. And don't worry about that number. Just the lower VI that you have consistently means that you're more consistently pedaling throughout the entire ride. It's smoother. You're doing more effort there. Your VI goes up when you are charging up that hill, working out really hard, and then you need to recover coming back down, which means then you pause your pedal stroke, you're not putting any effort on those watts, and so your average watts is going to go down, your normalized power is going to be higher, and the ratio between those two is your variability index. The closer those two numbers are together, the lower your variability index is. Okay, so that's all that means is your variability index. You can see how smoothly you rode a particular course or particular effort. If you're doing a workout and you've got a hard effort for a period of time and then you've got some softer efforts, you know, obviously at that point, you're going to have some variety in your pedal stroke and your watts effort that you're going to have a higher VI than if you had a steady state or a tempo ride for that entire hour. Because now you have consistent effort going across there, your variability would be lower, you'd be closer to 1. When you have differences, you're putting out more power, you're climbing a hill, you're working really hard, you're gonna have more variability. Your variability index goes up. It's just a metric to let us know how smooth you are riding. In races, we want to have a lower VI. If we're doing short interval or we're trying to climb some hills, we're going to have a higher VI. And so it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. If it's high, it's bad. If it's low, it's good. But it depends on what you're doing and whether you attacked it appropriately, and then how well did you attack that. And as we get closer to races, we want to be able to train where even as we're going up hills, that we can shift our gears, be consistent as we're riding, and have a variability index closer to 1. Okay. Efficiency. Efficiency is really a ratio of your normalized power to heart rate. Okay, and this is where I get with my heart rate staying lower with higher watts, I get to look like I'm super efficient in that. So if we've got two of us and we're both putting out 200 watts average, and one of us has a heart rate of 160 and the other has a heart rate of 120, obviously the individual putting out the same watts with a lower heart rate has a higher EF, efficiency factor. Okay, so you could look at your EF over a few rides, similar rides, and over your training, that EF should get better. You should be able to do the same effort with a lower heart rate. Same as if you were running, and here's where EF would come into running. If you're running at the same pace at a lower heart rate, your efficiency factor would be better. It'd be improved. It would be a progression. And you could look at your EF on your runs, similar efforts, to see how that went. Okay, so efficiency factor. It's a way to compare similar workouts. You know, you could compare and see how well did you do a workout 2 months ago. You're doing it now. Maybe your pace is the same, but your heart rate cost is lower. Or maybe what you see is at the same heart rate, you're able to go faster. So faster pace with the same heart rate means you're more efficient. Same pace with a lower heart rate means you're more efficient. So if you see EF and you're like, what does that mean? You now know. Intensity factor. Oh my gosh, we've had VI, variability index, EF, efficiency. Now we're going to talk about intensity factor, IF. This is another ratio of your normalized power to your FTP. So efficiency is normalized power relative to your heart rate. Intensity is if you know your FTP for 1 hour, your max effort is 200, and you're riding at 200 for that hour, what's your intensity? 100. You did what you could do 100%. So it's a percentage. So your intensity factor is simply a relative intensity for that workout. Normalized power divided by threshold power. So if you had a FTP of 200 and you rode at 150, you would have an intensity factor of 0.75. 3/4 of it'd be set 150 would be 75% of 200. So your intensity factor would be 0.75, 75%. Different ride, different ride, you get the same FTP, but you average 180. You all can do the math. I think that's be an 80%. Okay, so it'd be 0.8 or 80% intensity factor. So the intensity went from 75 to 85 or to 80%. If you've got a workout that your intensity factor is above 1, I would question whether your FTP is accurate. Because if it's above 100%, that would mean that if your FTP was set at at 200, and that says that's the max you could hold for 1 hour because that's your max test, and you're able to actually ride 210, so you get 105%, your FTP is probably not accurate. And so another way to look at your FTP is we can have some real rides and use your intensity factor to see how close we are to your FTP. We could use it to compare workouts. How intense was that relative to your FTP? That's all intensity factor is looking at, is trying to give you a metric that you can compare different rides based on their intensity. But we could also use your intensity factor to see how close your threshold is. Because if you do a test and some people just aren't really good at holding a 20-minute hard effort, and so they have a lower predicted FTP. They got their ride and something just magically happens. They're riding at a higher wattage. Well, is the real ride at 100 or for the hour where you put out a higher wattage? Is that your FTP? Because you just did it. Or is the predicted value it? Well, we could use your intensity factor and make some guesses and some extrapolations, and we would use a couple different data points and perhaps adjust then your FTP. Okay, so variability index, how smooth are you pedaling? How consistent are you pedaling? How's that going? Your efficiency factor is a ratio of heart rate to your normalized power. Intensity factor is a percentage of your FTP and your normalized power of how intensely are you riding. And we use all of those to compare different rides, and we can compare different people. So like, let's say that I'm riding at an intensity factor of 0.8 and you're riding an intensity factor of 0.6, and we're going the same pace. Well done. You don't have to work as hard to get the same effort. But then I could look at you and say, well, you're just not working very hard. And now I know you've got more in the tank, and we can make that go faster. You can look at that and go, yeah, that felt really hard, but it was really only 60%. My intensity was only 60% or 70%, and make some determinations of how your RPE and how that felt and what you were doing, and get some feedback there as well. Now I'm gonna pause just for a second, because as we get into all of those pieces, I mean, some of that we can start getting our eyes crossed, and we can start going, holy crap, that's a lot of math, and we've got a lot of details. And there are, and that's why why we're having this, so we can talk about some of those metrics, and I'm hopeful that you'll go back and watch this a couple of times if it doesn't make sense. And if you watched it a second time and it still doesn't make sense, let's have a conversation, because I want you to understand these things, at least from a general term, of what I'm looking at, of what you can look at to see how well your rides went. You'll now know some of the secrets behind things, what comments that I make to you at different times about, you'll say you had a really good ride, and then I'll start asking you questions of, really? How was that? You might not have had much sleep. You might have been really stressed, and your body's working really hard. The RPE felt higher, but your intensity factor is fairly low. Still might feel hard. So a lot of different things we can pull in that. Okay. Now we're going to take all of that and start talking about deeper information. You ready? So TSS, training stress scores. TSS uses a lot of different data to come up with a number. It's a composite number that looks at duration, intensity of a given workout, and gives you a training stress score. It uses normalized power, it uses the intensity factor, and it uses the duration that you did that to give you a training stress score. TSS. Obviously, the higher the TSS, the harder the workout. If you had a intensity factor of 1, okay, so you worked out for 100%, you would have a TSS of 100. You can't get a TSS greater than 100 in an hour. If you want a higher TSS, if you want a 200 TSS, you've got to work out at 100% effort for 2 hours. If you worked out 100% for 30 minutes, what's your TSS? 50. If you worked out for an hour at 75% effort, 75% of your FTP, what's your TSS? 75. If you did 2 hours at 75% effort, what's your TSS? 150. Simple math. The harder and longer your ride, the higher your TSS is going to be. So I can get a 100 TSS by riding 1 hour if I ride 100% intensity factor. I could get 100 TSS if I rode 2 hours and rode a 50% intensity factor. So why do we even look at TSS? TSS, that training stress score, you get stress on your body. And Training Peaks came up with this metric of looking at fatigue and overload, and what's overtraining, what should be your workload, what should be an intensity for a race, that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of data and I'm gonna call it experimentation, but a lot of learning that we look at in terms of what should your TSS be in certain phases of your training, in certain race durations, and in certain intensities for that race duration. And there's a bunch of different opinions on what your TSS should be going into a given race, where it should be coming through. I look at TSS, I use TSS, but at the same time, I want to talk to you, and I want you to give me feedback about how you're feeling. When I'm putting together workout durations and intensities and that sort of thing, I use some thought process behind the TSS. Some of your workouts you'll see in the top descriptor or title bar. Some of them I have listed TSS. That's for me of some workouts that I've got developed where I know what that TSS is, and sometimes I bring those up. Sometimes I haven't taken the time to actually write that out. But if you look in your planned workouts, many times you'll see a duration, a pace, and if you look down, you'll see a planned TSS. When you get done, or after that workout's completed, you can go back into your Training Peaks and you'll see your completed TSS. Sometimes the TSS is higher than what was planned. What did you do? You either went longer or more intense than what was planned. If your TSS was less than what was planned, what did you do? You went shorter or not as intensely as what was planned. Okay. If you look across in your Training Peaks, you look at your week. At the far right, you'll see a weekly average, and you'll see what a predicted TSS would be for that week. You can see what you completed, what your TSS actually was for that week. And that's, again, just your training stress score. I wouldn't get locked into those numbers. I wouldn't tell you to dive too deeply into those and let those metrics overwhelm you. But that's what they mean. That's what they're looking at. A couple other things that you might come across. One is your acute training load. That's the amount of fatigue that you've had over the last 7 days. Your acute training load. So if you're in a slow build or you're in an aerobic base, your acute training load is going to be a lot less than when you're in your peak training or you're in a heavy build. because it's looking at the last 7 days. Chronic training load, or CTL, that's your fitness. Yeah, that's your average stress over the last 40 days. I think it's actually 6 weeks, so it'll be 42 days. So it's looking at that. What's the average fitness? What's your average stress been over the last 6 weeks? Okay. It uses TSS. It looks at heart rate and how all those things go. The formula that they're using within Training Peaks is different than what they would be using in Garmin. And that's why many times when you guys tell me what your Garmin says, I'm like, oh, okay. Great. Garmin tells me all kinds of things. They just use a different metric than what Training Peaks may use. They use a different metric than what I may use or what I may rely upon. They're not necessarily good or bad or better than or that way, but you got to use the same one to be consistent. Okay. So if you're looking at your Training Peaks TSS or your Training Peaks CTL or your Training Peaks ATL, you may see a different number when you go to Garmin or Apple or wherever you're looking at those pieces, but that's what they're looking at. Acute training load within the last week, chronic training load in the last 6 weeks, 7 days, 42 days, 1 week, 6 weeks. Okay. And then here comes a fancy term. It's called decoupling. We used to call it something different. Decoupling that they're calling right now, it's basically power to heart rate, right? So you're comparing your efficiency factor from the first half to the second half. Okay. You want that number to be less than 5%. I'll tell you what we used to call it. Generally, if your decoupling is less than 5%, or your second half is within 5% pacing, heart rate, all that kind of stuff of your first half, you've got a good coupling. When it gets over 5%, you started to decouple. Okay. So let's look at this. So if I'm out running, I'm running a 10K. The first 5K I come through in 20 minutes. My overall time is 48 minutes. First half was 20 minutes. Second half was 28 minutes. I decoupled. My second half was slower than my first half. If I look at the heart rate, my heart rate probably was a lot higher in that second half, and I'm going slower. I decoupled. I can't really say the exact words that my coaches used to call me when I decoupled, but I faded. Okay. Either I went out too hard in the first half, or I just wasn't fit enough to be able to do that in the second half. Okay. That's all decoupling means, is that your second half is greater than 5% of your first half. Okay. All kinds of reasons: lack of fitness, fatigue, sleep, dehydration, stress. They're overwhelmed. They got life stress going. I'm not talking about the stress of the workout. I'm talking about life stress going on that they just can't hold that duration. And you could look at a half marathon, the second half of the second 10K of a half marathon being significantly slower than the first. You had a decoupling. Hopefully we don't get into that too much. Fitness be way off. Usually see this when you're doing shorter durations and you're getting into some sort of fitness. So we'd look at 5K or a 10K and kind of compare first and second halves of a specific workout. You could do on the bike, the run, the swim. Did you have a decoupling? Was the second half significantly slower than the first half? Okay. A few other pieces I want to just throw by you. Aerobic simply means that you're using a lot of oxygen. It's usually done at a slower, less intense area. You can use the aerobic pacing fitness things relative to swim, bike, and run. Anaerobic is when you're not using oxygen. You're not holding your breath, but this is anaerobic things that are done for a much shorter period of time, and you could and you're not relying on your breathing. I mean, when you get done, you are trying to gasp and catch up on your breathing because you went into an anaerobic phase, if you will. Okay. It's going to flow, I hope. When you've done an anaerobic effort, so you're running 100 yards and you're running as fast as you can, you're still breathing during that time. But as soon as you get done with that sprint, you put your hands on your knees and you're gasping for breath and you're trying to recover, get all that oxygen back inside of you. You're now in EPOC, which is excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption. That's when you're trying to regain it. You went into a deficit. Now you've got to use that time to get it back. Okay. So EPOC, EPOC, excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption. That's when you've put yourself in a deficit during an anaerobic event and you're trying to recover from it. Your hands usually on your knees, or so now you could be during your intervals when you're going at a lower pace. Could be, you've seen this sometimes in class where you're doing some squats or some burpees and you're going up and down, and while you're doing it, you're fine. But as soon as you stop, you have to breathe really hard. Your heart rate goes up. That's called EPOC. That's in your trying to recover from that workout. DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. This is when you've worked out and you have some soreness the next day, or you have some fatigue going on in those muscles the next day. Just as it sounds, delayed onset muscle soreness. It's one of those things where it's one of my pet peeves that when my colleagues or when somebody starting a new workout, when they have excessive DOMS, when they're more than just tight or sore, when they have trouble moving and they're complaining about, oh, I can't even sit up, I can't use my arms. That's an injury. That's significant DOMS. Those are bad things. I don't like seeing DOMS when you've got pain. You may have some DOMS where you're tight the next day. If we do this right, we get into several different sessions, 2 or 3 sessions, which means about a week to 2 weeks. We can push as hard as we want in the class now, and you won't have DOMS. Your body will be able to adapt and get rid of that lactate, which is going to cause all that pain. Okay. So we've gone through a bunch of stuff today. If any of this doesn't make sense, I hope that you'll maybe re-listen to it. Maybe I just spoke too fast, or reach out. Let's discuss these in person. Let's talk about these as they apply to you. Let's ask those questions. The more that you understand these details, when you're looking at a workout, you can better understand what your body's doing. Everything from, what's my average heart rate on this workout? How does it feel on this workout? What's my pacing on this workout? All the generalized metrics. But now you can look at your variability index, your intensity factor, your efficiency factor, your vertical oscillation, your strokes per length, all those things, and look at your progress or process of fitness and fitness gains. Thank you, guys.